Good morning. Let me orient you again to the pregnant uterus. So the, so the fetus is inside, surrounded by the amniotic fluid, kept in place by the amniotic sac. The placenta is the communication between the mother and the fetus and is connected to the fetus via the umbilical cord. I am mentioning all of this because our topic is all about disorders of the amniotic fluid volume, abnormalities in the placenta, membranes, and the umbilical cord. So let's start with the amniotic fluid. In the ultrasound, we can see the amount of amniotic fluid because anything that is black surrounding the fetus represents the fluid. Let's start with the basic roles of the amniotic fluid. So it creates a physical space for the fetal skeleton to shape normally. So with an adequate amniotic fluid, the fetus has the ability to move around. Without an adequate amount of amniotic fluid, compression deformities like this can actually occur. Second function is to promote fetal lung development. Without any amniotic fluid, the fetal lung will fail to develop. And of course, because it's a space between the uterus and the fetus, it avoids compression of the umbilical cord. Without the amniotic fluid, a type of fetal distress called variable deceleration in the fetal heart rate can actually occur. Production of the amniotic fluid differs in each trimester. During the first trimester, it is mainly an ultrafiltrate of the maternal plasma. In the second trimester, the fetal plasma contributes, but water transport across the fetal skin will only continue until keratinization occurs at around 22 to 25 weeks. Fetal urine production occurs at 8 to 11 weeks, but becomes contributor to the amniotic fluid volume only after 18 weeks. You can see that the fetal urination, swallowing, and inspiration are the following mechanisms which will modulate the amount of amniotic fluid volume. In this table, you can see several pathways that can modulate the amniotic fluid volume. We can measure the amniotic fluid volume antepartally through the use of ultrasound. One way is to measure the AFI done by calculating the vertical depths of each pocket in the maternal abdomen. So this is the ultrasound. The probe measures the amount of each pocket in all of the four quadrants. So the normal value is 5 to 24. We call it oligohydramnios in the amniotic fluid index if the value is less than 5. Polyhydramnios if the value is more than 24. Another way to measure the amniotic fluid volume is by only measuring the single vertical pocket. In the single vertical pocket approach, the normal value is 2 to 8 centimeter. Let us now discuss polyhydramnios. There are many causes, but most commonly, hydramnios or polyhydramnios is secondary to a fetal anomaly, multifetal pregnancy, or maternal diabetes. Examples of anomalies that may lead to polyhydramnios are esophageal atresia, neural tube defects like spina bifida. We will just discuss the pathophysiology of these anomalies leading to polyhydramnios during our synchronous meeting. Here is the mechanism of hydramnios when there is maternal diabetes. And here are the other causes of polyhydramnios. Before, we had a referral because of a severely distended abdomen. Ultrasound revealed polyhydramnios that is probably secondary to a mass called sacrococcygeal teratoma. We will discuss again the pathophysiology when we meet. Probably I could ask someone to recite on why polyhydramnios may occur in cases like this. This table contains different examples of anomalies and their corresponding mechanism. So the diagnosis of polyhydramnios is suggested clinically when it is very hard to palpate for the fetal parts, when it's hard to hear the fetal heart tone. The fetal heart tone may be there, but is not audible or is muffled. But definitive diagnosis is only done by measuring the amniotic fluid index or the single vertical pocket through the ultrasound. So you can see here, by measuring the four quadrants, the ultrasound can already give you the total amount of the volume and anything that is more than 24 is considered polyhydramnios. Symptoms of polyhydramnios may include the following. These symptoms are due to pressure exerted by the over-distended uterus upon the adjacent organs. Maternal complications can either include but not limited to placental abruption, uterine dysfunction, and postpartum hemorrhage. Again, during our synchronous meeting, I could probably ask someone to discuss why these complications, whether in the mother or in the fetus, can actually occur. Management of polyhydramnios depends on the severity. Minor and moderate degrees rarely require treatment. However, if there is already maternal discomfort or if there are already signs that the pregnancy is going into preterm labor, then hospitalization and management are already necessary. Please take note that bed rest, diuretics, water and salt restrictions are considered ineffective treatment. Management of polyhydramnios can either be surgical or medical. Surgical management is invasive, done through the so-called amnioreduction. This is done through the invasive insertion of a spinal needle into the uterus to drain the fluid. So we will just discuss the technique when we meet. And during the synchronous meeting, I can show you a video on how amnioreduction is actually done. Medical management includes the use of a prostaglandin synthase inhibitor called indomethacin. Please read on the mechanism of action and the dose. This medical therapy is not done beyond 32 weeks and not given more than 48 hours due to the risk of potential closure of the fetal ductus arteriosus. So let us now go to oligohydramnios. Oligohydramnios is decreased amniotic fluid volume. You already know the definition with regard AFI and SVP. This is more common during the later part of pregnancy because towards the end of pregnancy or towards the later part of pregnancy, the amount of amniotic fluid volume normally decreases. But it can also occur in pathogenic conditions like chronic placental insufficiency. One maternal condition that can bring about this is hypertension. Early in pregnancy, it has a bad prognosis because of the probability of pulmonary immaturity or pulmonary hypoplasia. And there is, of course, of cord compression that can lead to fetal distress. Here are some of the causes of oligohydramnios. During our meeting, we might discuss this one by one. Examples of or causes of early onset oligohydramnios may include the following. And here are some of the congenital anomalies associated with oligohydramnios. So early onset oligohydramnios may lead to the so-called Potter syndrome. Here are the components. Okay, why is there pulmonary hypoplasia and Potter syndrome? We will just discuss during our meeting. Okay, this is the pathophysiology of pulmonary hypoplasia whenever there is no fluid, especially in AOGs less than 24 weeks. All right, here are the other fetal outcomes, and management of oligohydramnios actually depends on the age of gestation. Simply put, if there is already oligohydramnios and the pregnancy is already 36 weeks, the management is straightforward, and that is delivery. But if the oligohydramnios is secondary to premature or preterm premature rupture of the membranes, since the bag of water has already ruptured, delivery is earlier at 34 weeks. When there is oligohydramnios and the AOG is less than 36 weeks and the bag of water is intact, then expected management is in place, but with increased fetal surveillance. The goal is to bring the pregnancy as close to 36 weeks as possible, but delivery is already indicated when there is fetal compromise. If amnioreduction is the surgical or invasive treatment for polyhydramnios, amnioinfusion is a treatment for oligo, specifically if this is to address repetitive variable decelerations. Please remember that amnioinfusion is not indicated to hydrate the uterus when there is meconium-stained amniotic fluid. The only indication for amnioinfusion is to treat repetitive variable deceleration secondary to cord compression. Let us now discuss the abnormalities of the placenta, the membranes, and the umbilical cord. Placental abnormalities are better understood with knowledge of what is a normal placenta. At term, the typical placenta weighs about 470 grams, round to oval in shape, 22 centimeter approximately in diameter. It is composed of the placental disc, the extraplacental membranes, and the three-vessel umbilical cord. The maternal surface is the basal plate divided into cotyledons, and the fetal surface is the chorionic plate into which the umbilical cord inserts. So putting it side by side, this is the basal plate and this is the chorionic plate. Here are some abnormalities of the placenta with a singleton fetus. So we can have a bilobe placenta, a succenturiate placenta or a succenturiate lobe, defined as the presence of one or more accessory lobes in the membranes at a distance from the main placenta. The main problem here is when the placenta is delivered, this accessory lobe can be left behind, and that can lead to postpartum hemorrhage secondary to a retained placental secundine. This is placenta membranacea, a ring-shaped placenta, placenta fenestrata. Extracordial placentation is defined or is the diagnosis when the chorionic plate of the placenta is smaller than the basal plate, making the periphery of the placenta uncovered. There are two types of extracordial placentation. One is circummarginate, the other one is circumvallate. During our synchronous meeting, I will call someone to differentiate the two. Abnormal invasion of the uterus can either lead to placenta accreta, increta, and percreta. This topic will again be discussed in postpartum hemorrhage. But let us discuss during the synchronous meeting what is the difference between accreta, increta, and percreta, and what are the most common causes of these abnormal placental adherence. Functionally, placental perfusion disorders can be grouped into those in which there is disrupted maternal blood flow to or within the intervillous space, and those with disturbed fetal blood flow through the villi. Please read these topics in your book. Regarding placental tumors, GTD or GTN will be discussed as a separate topic. Malignant tumors rarely metastasize to the placenta. Of those that do, melanomas, leukemias, and lymphomas, and breast cancer are the most common. Metastasis to the fetus is uncommon, but possible with melanoma. Chorioangioma, chorangioma, on the other hand, is considered the only benign tumor of the placenta. This is described as a well-circumscribed, rounded, predominantly hypoechoic lesion near the chorionic plate and protruding into the chorionic or into the amniotic cavity. Here are the complications of chorioangioma or chorangioma. You can see from this picture that chorangioma or chorioangioma is a well-vascularized mass. This can lead actually to fetal anemia and the following complications. I will call again someone to discuss the pathophysiology, why these things happen when there is placental chorioangioma. Let us now discuss abnormalities of the membrane. One common abnormality that we can see normally among our parturients is the meconium staining of the amniotic fluid. All right, there are three clinical settings that may lead to meconium passage. The first two are physiologic, and only in 33% of the cases is meconium staining of the amniotic fluid is considered pathologic. Here are the possible complications. All right, so whenever the fetus passes meconium in utero, the meconium will not harm the fetus unless the fetus becomes hypoxic. Because if you can remember respiratory physiology, the only time that the fetus will gasp is when the PO2 concentration decreases, the PCO2 increases. So when there is fetal hypoxia, meconium aspiration can occur, and this can lead to the so-called meconium aspiration syndrome. However, we can predict this antenatally by just looking at the fetal heart rate pattern. If the fetal heart rate is normal, meaning the baseline heart rate, the variability is good, there are accelerations and there are no decelerations, we can actually safely say that the fetus has no hypoxia. Therefore, meconium aspiration is unlikely. My point is, even if the fluid is stained by meconium, this is not always pathologic, and this is not always a reason to do cesarean section. Another problem that we can have in the membrane is chorioamnionitis. Full thickness infection of the membrane is actually called intraamnionic infection, and chorioamnionitis is a histopathologic diagnosis of the placenta. Here are the routes of infection, and most commonly, the cause is coming from an ascending infection from the lower genital tract. Here's the pathology, and here are the possible complications. Intraamnionic infection or chorioamnionitis is usually managed by delivery, but again, cesarean section is not always indicated. Other abnormalities of the membrane may include amnionodosum or the presence of amniotic bands. Okay, several pictures, several videos will be shown during our synchronous meeting. Let us now go to the abnormalities of the umbilical cord. Please remember that the umbilical cord has 3 vessels. How many arteries, how many veins? We will discuss it during our meeting. Here is the normal length. Problems that can occur when there are short cords are the following. Problems that may occur when the cords are very long are actually the following. Problems can arise when there is hypercoiling or hypocoiling of the umbilical cord. Again, as I have said, there should be 3 vessels, 2 umbilical artery and 1 umbilical vein. It is not uncommon to see in the ultrasound that the fetus has only a single umbilical artery. The most common etiology is atrophy of a previously normal umbilical artery. If it is an isolated finding, then that is a good prognosis. However, if this is accompanied by other congenital anomalies, then the probability of aneuploidy is actually increased. So this is a 3-vessel cord. You can see here the 2 arteries and 1 vein. And this is a single umbilical cord, only 1 artery and 1 big umbilical vein. Cord insertion abnormalities can either be any of the following, but not limited to: a battledore placenta or a marginal insertion. The umbilical cord should be inserted somewhere in the middle. So this is not normal. It is inserted at the periphery. It's called marginal insertion. Furcate insertion, this is the definition. Or a velamentous insertion, wherein the umbilical vessels is spread within the membrane, distant from the placental margin. Velamentous insertion is the etiology of the so-called vasa previa, where the fetal vessels in the membrane present at the level of the internal os. You can recall from your topic in second year, normal mechanism of normal labor and delivery, that during the time of the delivery, the bag of water can either spontaneously rupture or can be artificially ruptured by doing amniotomy. So just try to remember, if the fetal vessels are located near the internal os, during the time of bag rupture, this can lead also to the rupture of the fetal vessels, and that can lead to fetal bleeding, and that can lead to fetal exsanguination. Okay, so this is a picture showing the fetal vessels in the membrane, distant from its insertion in the placenta, and the fetal vessel is presenting in the internal os, and that is called vasa previa. Okay, what is the cause of the vasa previa? Velamentous insertion of the umbilical cord. When this is ruptured, you are basically allowing the baby to bleed. Other cord abnormalities are the following: false nuts, true nuts, or loops that can be actually found around the neck. This is what we call the nuchal cord coil, sometimes so severe enough that it can lead to fetal death, or some examples of torsion. Okay, when this lead to fetal death, we actually call it cord accident. All placenta and umbilical cord should be examined in the delivery room, but routine placental examination by a pathologist, meaning sending all placentas, membranes, umbilical cord into the laboratory, is actually not routine. But examining it inside the delivery room before it is disposed is actually part of routine delivery. Okay, here are some of the indications where the placenta is sent for histopathologic examination by a pathologist. Okay, this is, I think, is the last slide. So we will discuss again this in detail. I will entertain all questions when we have our synchronous meeting. Thank you so much for reading this slide and have a good day. Thank you.